The spring of 1816 drifted gently across the English countryside, painting the hills of Ashcombe in a wash of pale gold. Morning light poured through the tall windows of the manor house, spilling across polished oak floors and fading tapestries that whispered of a more splendid age. Within those quiet halls lived Lady Margaret Ashcombe, widow of the late Lord Henry Ashcombe, who had fallen on the continent 5 years before. The estate, once full of guests, laughter, and candlelight, now carried a stillness that clung to every corridor like a lingering breath. Margaret had learned to move within that silence with practiced grace. Her step was measured, her voice soft, her thoughts folded neatly within. To her neighbours, she was the very image of composure, the kind of woman who never allowed sorrow to show on her face. They admired her restraint, mistaking her calm for peace. In truth, her composure was a fortress built from habit. Beneath it, a restlessness pulsed like an unhealed wound. Each morning she tended her garden herself, refusing the help of servants. Among the rows of white roses her late husband had once planted, she found the only comfort she could still touch. She clipped each stem with precision, brushing away the dew with her gloved fingertips, though the scent of the blossoms sometimes reminded her too sharply of the past. Henry had loved those roses. He used to say that their pale petals mirrored her complexion, and she had blushed then, younger, believing his words. That memory returned now and again, not as warmth but as ache. Grief had long since ceased to be a storm. It was a quiet tide that rose and fell within her without warning. Beyond her walled garden, life in the nearby village went on with the steady rhythm of ordinary days. The church bell marked the hours. Carriages passed by the gates with polite indifference. Occasionally visitors called out of duty rather than affection. They spoke to her of parish improvements, of harvests, of upcoming balls she never attended. They praised her dignity, and she thanked them, always smiling faintly, always detached. They did not know that when the doors closed behind them, the smile fell away like a dropped mask. She had grown used to solitude, yet there were moments, especially in the dusk, when the silence pressed too heavily against her heart. On those evenings, she would open the writing desk in her sitting room and read through her late husband's few remaining letters, written in his bold hand before the war had taken him. His words spoke of duty and honor, of longing to return. They ended abruptly with his last note, penned from a field hospital on the eve of his final battle. He had written of love and gratitude, and she had read those lines until they had nearly worn thin from her touch. Now, as she stood by the window, the spring breeze stirring her veil, Margaret wondered what remained of her life beyond memory. She was 35 years old, not yet old but no longer young. Her beauty softened into something gentler, more reflective. The village gossips said she might remarry, but such talk faded quickly. There was no suitor, and she gave no encouragement. The world expected widows to fade gracefully, and she had obliged. That morning began like any other. The housekeeper entered with the quiet efficiency of long habit, setting a tray of letters upon the table. Margaret sorted them absently. Most were invitations or notices from acquaintances in London. Only one caught her attention, its seal plain, its handwriting unfamiliar. It bore the mark of the army. A letter from the front, though the war was long over. Her pulse quickened slightly as she broke the seal. The message was brief and formal. A Captain James Harland requested permission to visit Ashcombe Hall. He bore with him a box of personal effects belonging to her late husband, recovered from military storage. Margaret read the lines twice, uncertain what she felt. After so many years, why now? Yet she found herself writing a reply before she could question the impulse. She would receive him, she said, at his convenience. 2 days later, under a grey sky, a rider appeared at the gates. Margaret watched from the drawing-room as the man dismounted. His uniform coat was worn but well kept, his posture straight despite a slight unevenness in his step. When the servant announced his arrival, she rose, smoothing the folds of her simple gown. She had forgotten what it felt like to meet someone connected to her husband's last days. The introduction was polite, almost awkward. Captain Harland bowed and presented a small wooden box, its surface scarred from travel. His voice held the measured tone of a man used to command yet tempered by humility. He spoke briefly of the late Lord Ashcombe's courage, of the respect he had earned among his men. Margaret listened, her hands clasped tightly before her. When she lifted the lid of the box, she found a few personal items, a signet ring, a pocket watch, a worn leather notebook, and a folded letter she did not recognize. The sight of her husband's handwriting struck her like a physical touch. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Harland cleared his throat and offered his condolences once more. Margaret thanked him with quiet composure, though inside something trembled. She noticed the faint tremor in his hand, the pallor beneath the tan of his skin. The war had left its marks on him as surely as grief had marked her. As the rain began outside, she invited him to take tea before departing. He hesitated, but the weather left little choice. They sat opposite each other in the high-ceilinged parlor, the ticking of the clock filling the silence between their careful sentences. When he spoke of the battlefield, his words carried no bravado, only the weary honesty of one who had seen too much. Margaret listened, drawn by that quiet sincerity. When he finally took his leave, the rain still fell, soft as morning veils against the glass. After he was gone, she returned to the box. The letter lay unopened in her hand. It was addressed simply, "To my dearest Margaret, should this reach you." Her breath caught. She had thought she possessed all her husband's final words. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the page, unaware that the act of reading would awaken a chain of events neither she nor the quiet stranger could yet imagine. Before you leave this story tonight, if you felt the stir of curiosity in Lady Margaret's solitude, subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Every story here begins with a single listener who believes that love, even when long delayed, still finds its way home. The rain that had begun as a gentle drizzle soon deepened into a steady downpour that cloaked the countryside in grey. By the time Captain Harland mounted his horse, the path beyond the gates had already turned to mire. Margaret watched from the drawing room as he hesitated near the carriage house, clearly debating whether to continue. His horse tossed its head uneasily, unwilling to step into the storm. When the butler entered moments later to inform her that the captain's journey might be delayed, Margaret did not hesitate. She ordered that the guest chamber be prepared and sent word that he was welcome to remain until the weather improved. It was not kindness alone that moved her. Something about the man's manner lingered in her thoughts. There had been sincerity in his eyes, a quiet dignity, untainted by pride. It had been so long since she had met anyone who spoke without artifice that she found herself oddly reluctant to let him vanish into the rain. She turned from the window, uncertain whether her impulse was hospitality or a faint echo of loneliness. By evening, the house glowed with candlelight, and the storm pressed against the windows like an impatient visitor. Margaret descended to the dining room where a modest supper had been laid. When Harland entered, he looked uncomfortable in borrowed clothes, his wet uniform set aside to dry. The garments were a little too fine for him, though he wore them with the restrained bearing of a man used to discipline. He thanked her for her hospitality with the same formal grace that had marked his arrival. They dined together in near silence at first, the clink of silverware mingling with the distant rumble of thunder. Margaret felt strangely aware of every sound, every pause. Her guests in years past had been noisy, careless, full of chatter about London or the latest scandal. The captain's quiet presence seemed almost foreign in its simplicity. She asked about his regiment, and he replied with brevity, never lingering on his own achievements. When she mentioned her husband's name, he straightened slightly, his expression softening into something like reverence. "Lord Ashcombe was a man others followed willingly," he said. "He carried courage as if it were ordinary." The words were offered without embellishment, and Margaret found them more moving for their restraint. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment, her throat tightening. After a pause, she asked about the final days of the campaign. His eyes clouded. He told her of the cold nights, the endless marches, the way laughter had disappeared from the men's faces long before the last battle. When he spoke of the day her husband fell, his voice grew quieter still. "He saved more lives than he ever knew," he said, "including mine." Margaret sat very still. There were details in his account that were new to her, glimpses of courage and exhaustion she had never imagined. The thought that this man across from her carried living memory of her husband stirred something deep within her, part pain, part comfort. When he stopped speaking, she realized she had been holding her breath. She thanked him softly, though gratitude felt too small a word. After supper, she led him to the library where a fire burned low in the grate. The warmth softened the edges of the storm outside. They spoke of indifferent things, the estate, the neighboring lands, the books on her shelves. Yet beneath their conversation ran an unspoken current of shared weariness. Both had lived too long with ghosts. When the clock struck 10, Margaret rose, reluctant to end the evening. The captain stood as well, bowing with measured courtesy. She wished him a restful night, and he murmured his thanks before retreating to the guest chamber prepared for him. Alone again, Margaret moved to the hearth. The fire's glow reflected in the polished brass of the clock, throwing soft light across the room. She thought of the unopened letter that still waited on her desk upstairs. The idea of reading it filled her with unease. Something in the captain's story had changed her understanding of her husband's death. She no longer knew what comfort or pain might lie within those folded lines. The rain outside seemed to echo her hesitation. She left the letter untouched and climbed the stairs slowly, the candle trembling in her hand. In the small hours, a sound woke her, a faint cry, quickly stifled. She rose, wrapping her shawl about her shoulders, and stepped into the dim corridor. A light glowed faintly beneath the guest chamber door. She hesitated, then knocked. The voice that answered was strained but composed. "Forgive me, my lady. A dream only." She opened the door despite his protest. The captain sat on the edge of the bed, his shirt clinging to him with sweat, his eyes unfocused as though he was still seeing some battlefield long vanished. His hands shook. Without thinking, she crossed the room and poured water from the pitcher beside the lamp, offering it to him. He accepted it wordlessly, his breath unsteady. "It passes," he said after a moment. She saw then the deep scar that marked his shoulder, the old wound that must ache whenever the weather turned. The war, she thought, had not ended for men like him. It lived behind their eyes, waiting for the dark. She said nothing more, but drew the curtain tighter to block the storm's flash. When she left him, his breathing had eased. Back in her own room, sleep would not come. She thought of his expression when he spoke of her husband's honor, mingled with guilt, as though memory were both a burden and a duty. She wondered what secret weight he carried. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Sunlight spilled across the garden, turning every raindrop into a bead of fire. When Margaret descended to breakfast, she found the captain already there, neatly dressed, his uniform restored to order. He thanked her for her kindness, and spoke of departing as soon as the roads allowed. She wanted to tell him he was welcome to stay, but propriety held her tongue. Instead, she walked with him to the front steps, where the scent of wet earth rose in the morning air. The world seemed newly made, yet something between them remained unfinished. He mounted his horse, pausing to bow once more. "You have my deepest respect, my lady," he said. She inclined her head, watching as he rode down the lane until the mist swallowed him from sight. Only then did she return indoors to the stillness of her house, aware that his presence had left behind an echo she could not quite name. That afternoon she carried the box of relics into the study once more. The letter lay atop the others, waiting. The wax seal cracked easily beneath her fingers. She read the first lines with a sense of reverence, her eyes tracing her husband's hand. But halfway down the page her breath caught. The tone was not farewell but confession. The words trembled with apology for something left unsaid. When she finished, she sat motionless, the letter trembling between her hands. Outside, the last clouds drifted away, leaving the sky bare and painfully bright. In the weeks that followed Captain Harland's departure, Ashcombe Hall returned to its usual stillness, yet something beneath that calm had changed. The echo of his presence lingered in rooms that had long been silent. Margaret caught herself listening for his step on the gravel path, though she knew he had gone. The letter he had delivered remained folded within her desk, read more than once yet never fully understood. Each time she returned to it, she found new weight in the phrasing, as if her late husband had written not to comfort, but to confess. The words seemed shaped by guilt, hinting at a burden carried by both men. Outside, spring ripened into the full warmth of early summer. The roses in the garden bloomed so thickly that their scent filled the corridors whenever a window stood open. Margaret spent long hours among them, pruning, binding, guiding their growth. The servants whispered that their mistress had taken new interest in the garden, but none dared remark upon the thoughtful stillness that followed her wherever she walked. Sometimes, when dusk settled, she would look toward the horizon and imagine the distant road that led away from the estate, winding through fields and villages. She wondered whether Captain Harland had found peace in his travels, or if the ghosts that haunted his dreams still followed close behind. One afternoon, as she was reading near the window, the butler entered with a hesitant step. "A visitor, my lady," he announced. She lifted her eyes, expecting some local acquaintance, but when he added the name, her heart gave an unsteady leap. Captain James Harland. The words felt unreal for a moment. She composed herself and instructed that he be shown in. When he entered, the years of discipline still clung to his bearing, but there was weariness about him, as if the journey had been long and uncertain. He bowed deeply. "Forgive my intrusion, my lady. I find myself in need of rest and a little employment while I recover from my injury. The physicians in London recommended the country air." His words were carefully measured, yet there was a quiet plea beneath them. Margaret regarded him with steady grace. The sight of him awakened an unexpected mixture of relief and apprehension. "You are welcome here," she said after a moment's pause. "Ashcombe Hall has always offered shelter to those in need of it. Come Lutman." So it was decided that Captain Harland would remain for a time, assisting with the management of the estate's grounds while he regained his strength. The servants, startled at first, soon grew accustomed to his presence. He worked with quiet diligence, inspecting fences, directing repairs, and helping in the stables when his shoulder allowed. Margaret saw him often from a distance, moving among the workers with an ease that commanded respect without effort. He never sought her attention, yet somehow their paths crossed daily, in the gardens, along the terraces, or near the stables at twilight. Their conversations at first were cautious, polite exchanges about weather, crops, and estate accounts. Gradually the tone softened. He spoke with rare intelligence, though always with restraint. Margaret found herself listening more than she intended, drawn by his calm steadiness. He never spoke of the war unless prompted, and when he did, his words carried no bitterness. Instead, there was a deep humility, a recognition of what had been lost. One afternoon, as they walked along the rose alleys, Margaret noticed that he favored his left arm again. The movement was almost imperceptible, but she saw it nonetheless. "You should rest," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "Work eases the ache better than idleness, my lady." She said nothing more, yet that quiet exchange stayed with her long after he had gone back to the fields. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the shadows stretched long across the lawns, he would sometimes bring her the day's reports. Standing at the library door as though reluctant to cross the threshold, she would motion him in, offering tea or wine, and they would speak until the candles burned low. Those hours carried a strange tranquility, like the slow unfolding of a long-forgotten melody. It was during one of those evenings that Margaret realized how little laughter had touched her house in years. The captain did not laugh often, but when he did, the sound was soft and unguarded, and it stirred something within her, an echo of the life she had believed ended with her husband's death. She began to notice small things, the gentleness of his hands when he handled fragile tools, the way he removed his hat before addressing even the humblest servant, the quiet patience in his gaze. Summer deepened, the fields shimmered with heat, and the air hummed with insects. Margaret invited the villagers to a small harvest supper on the lawns, a tradition her husband had begun and she had long neglected. Captain Harland oversaw the arrangements, ensuring every detail was attended to. When the evening came, music drifted across the grass, and laughter rose like something reborn. Margaret moved among her guests with quiet dignity, accepting their thanks. More than once, her eyes sought the captain's figure among the crowd. When the lanterns were lit and the villagers departed, she lingered alone beneath the trees. The night was still, the scent of crushed grass sweet and heavy. She turned at the sound of footsteps and saw Harland approaching, his coat unbuttoned, his hair ruffled by the wind. "The evening was a success," he said. "You have given them something to remember." She thanked him, her voice softer than she intended. For a moment they stood together, the silence between them almost tender. Then a gust of wind passed, scattering petals from the rose arbor above. One fell upon his sleeve, and instinctively she reached to brush it away. Their hands met briefly, and the contact, though fleeting, sent a warmth through her that startled her more than it should have. She withdrew her hand quickly, murmuring something about the hour, and he stepped back, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. That night Margaret found sleep elusive. The quiet of the house no longer felt peaceful, but alive with unsaid words. She rose before dawn, walking the corridors as pale light crept through the windows. The world beyond the glass shimmered with dew. Somewhere outside, she heard the rhythmic sound of a spade striking earth. When she looked out, she saw Harland repairing the garden wall alone, his movements deliberate, steady. She stood watching for a long time, feeling an unfamiliar sense of calm. In the days that followed, a new rhythm settled between them, unspoken but sure. The loneliness that had defined her life seemed to loosen its hold, replaced by something quieter yet more powerful. She did not name it, for naming might have broken the spell. All she knew was that the echo of grief no longer filled every room. The air of Ashcombe Hall, once heavy with the past, now carried the faintest promise of renewal. The summer days passed with a languid grace that made time itself seem reluctant to move. Each morning at Ashcombe Hall began in quiet ritual, the sound of the gardener's rake, the faint clatter of breakfast trays, the rustle of letters being delivered to the study. Margaret found comfort in these patterns, yet something beneath them had begun to shift. The companionship that had grown between herself and Captain Harland no longer felt incidental. It had taken root, deep and silent, as if the house itself had drawn breath again after years of stillness. One morning, while sorting through the desk in her husband's old study, Margaret came upon the small wooden box that had started it all. It rested on a lower shelf, its surface dulled by dust and time. She lifted the lid carefully, intending only to return the contents to proper order. The letters lay as she had left them, bound neatly with a faded ribbon. Beneath them, she noticed something she had not seen before, a small pouch of worn leather, thin with age. Inside was a silver pendant engraved with two initials entwined, M and J. Her breath caught. The letters were her own initials, yet the other could not belong to Henry. His middle name had been Thomas. For a moment she stared, confusion rising into unease. It could have been a coincidence, an old trinket misplaced among the rest. Yet as she turned it in her hand, she saw the chain was broken, the metal dented as if once held tightly. A strange chill passed through her. When she next saw Captain Harland, he was walking along the terrace, overseeing repairs to the outer wall. She waited until the workers had gone before approaching him. "Captain," she said, holding the pendant out in her palm, "this was among my husband's effects. Do you know how it came to be there?" He froze, the sunlight catching the faint scar along his temple. For an instant his composure wavered. Then he said carefully, "It must have been placed there in error. The initials may belong to one of the men." "Which man?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "I cannot say." The pause stretched too long. Margaret studied him, noticing how his gaze did not meet hers. There was no malice in his manner, only a shadow of something withheld. She felt a tightening in her chest, not yet mistrust, but the faint tremor of doubt. "Very well," she said at last, her tone even. "I shall keep it safe until the rightful owner is known." He inclined his head, murmured his thanks, and turned away to resume his work. Yet the exchange lingered between them, an invisible wall where before there had been quiet ease. That night, Margaret lay awake, the pendant resting on the table beside her lamp. The initials gleamed faintly in the dim light. She traced them with her finger, wondering what connection bound the object to the man who had brought it to her door. Days passed. Outwardly, nothing changed. The captain continued his duties with his usual diligence, speaking little of himself. But Margaret's mind circled the matter with growing unease. The letter her husband had written, the one discovered in the box, spoke vaguely of a promise, of something left undone. Now this trinket had appeared, another fragment of a puzzle she could not piece together. One afternoon, as the air hung thick with the scent of roses, she found herself crossing the gardens to where Harland worked. He was kneeling near the fountain, setting new stones in place. The sight of him, sleeves rolled, face shadowed by sunlight and labor, stirred both admiration and confusion in her heart. She hesitated, watching him work, and realized she was no longer certain whether her unease came from mistrust or from the strange intimacy of shared solitude. When he noticed her, he rose at once, wiping his hands. "My lady," he said, his voice quiet, "I did not expect company." "I did not come to disturb you," she replied, "only to thank you. The gardens have not looked so alive in many years." He gave a modest nod. "The soil here is kind. It only needs attention. Like the heart, perhaps," she said without thinking. He looked at her, startled, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she added, "Do you miss the life you left behind, Captain?" "Every man who survives war leaves something behind," he said slowly. "But missing it would mean wishing to relive it. I would not." His answer, though simple, struck her as deeply honest. Still, the pendant weighed in her pocket, a cold reminder of unanswered questions. She wanted to trust him completely, but the shadow of uncertainty refused to lift. That evening, after dinner, Margaret took up her embroidery by the fire. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of wood as the night air cooled. Somewhere down the corridor she heard the faint sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate. When she looked up, Captain Harland stood in the doorway. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for my manner earlier. It was not my place to speak so curtly." "There is no need," she replied gently. "The past can weigh heavily on anyone. I understand." He seemed about to say more, but stopped, his jaw tightening as though he feared the words might betray him. After a brief pause, he bowed and withdrew. When he was gone, Margaret exhaled the breath she had not realized she was holding. The tension between them had shifted again, not gone, but changed, like a knot drawn tighter by restraint. Later, unable to rest, she returned to the study. The pendant lay where she had set it, gleaming faintly beside the stack of letters. She held it once more, feeling the cool metal press against her palm. For a moment she imagined her husband's voice, the echo of old promises, the faint laughter that used to fill these rooms. Then another image came Harlan's face, lined with the quiet dignity of a man burdened by remembrance. She did not know what truth bound them, but she sensed that the answer, when it came, would alter everything she believed about the man she had lost and the one who now walked her garden paths. The next morning dawned pale and clear. The storm of her thoughts had not eased, yet beneath it ran a strange calm, the certainty that the truth would reveal itself in time. She carried the pendant to her chamber and locked it away. As she turned the key, she whispered a silent vow to herself. She would wait, but she would no longer remain blind. Outside, the sun rose higher, spilling light over Ashcombe Hall. In that gentle brightness, the roses trembled in the breeze, their petals opening wide as though welcoming whatever truth the day might bring. Autumn arrived gently, creeping through the fields with a soft gold haze that turned the hedgerows to flame. The air at Ashcombe Hall carried the scent of ripened fruit and drying leaves. Margaret found herself standing often at the edge of the garden, watching the colours fade from the roses she had tended all summer. Their petals fell one by one, leaving behind the quiet dignity of stems preparing for rest. Life, she thought, always knew how to fold itself into silence before renewal. Captain Harland had settled into his duties, as if he had always belonged there. The villagers came to respect him quickly, noting his steady leadership and fairness. He oversaw the harvest with calm precision, spoke kindly to the workers, and never spared himself from labour. To Margaret's household, he had become indispensable, though none dared say so aloud. She, too, relied on him more than she wished to admit. His presence in the house was both comfort and disquiet, a constant reminder of the past she could neither forget nor fully understand. Yet with the rhythm of the season came a certain peace. The earlier tension between them had softened, replaced by a tentative trust that deepened in the stillness of shared days. They spoke often, though never of personal matters. Instead, their conversations drifted toward books, philosophy, or the turning of the weather. Margaret had long believed herself incapable of friendship with any man, but James Harland's quiet respect made such connection seem possible. One afternoon she came upon him repairing the stone wall near the orchard. The light slanted low, gilding the landscape. He worked slowly, one hand braced against the uneven stones. His sleeve had ridden up, revealing the pale scar that ran across his forearm. Margaret approached without meaning to disturb him, yet he turned as though sensing her presence. "You work too hard, Captain," she said. He smiled faintly. "A soldier is ill-suited to idleness, my lady." "Cool." Still, the estate would forgive a day's rest. "Perhaps," he replied, "but I find peace in simple labour." Something in his tone, an almost wistful calm, touched her unexpectedly. She wondered if he found in work what she sought in her garden, a way to keep grief at bay through the rhythm of care. When she offered to bring him tea, he thanked her, and the sound of her name upon his lips, spoken with quiet respect, lingered in her thoughts long after she left him. Later that evening, the two of them met again in the library to review accounts. A fire glowed in the hearth, throwing light over the polished wood and shelves lined with books her husband had collected. Harland sat across from her, reading through ledgers with patient concentration. Margaret found her gaze drifting from the figures to his face, noting the faint lines of fatigue, the way his eyes softened when he looked up to ask a question. When their hands brushed as she passed him a document, neither drew away immediately. The moment lasted only a breath, yet it left her heart unsteady. The letter from her husband remained hidden in the drawer beside her. She had not spoken of it again, nor of the pendant locked in her chamber. Some instinct told her the truth would come in its own time. Still, the unease persisted, curling like mist at the edges of her mind. There were times she caught Harland watching her with an expression she could not decipher, something between longing and regret. As the days shortened, Ashcombe Hall grew quieter. The servants lit lamps early, and the crackle of fires became the music of the season. On the first evening of true chill, Margaret invited Harland to dine with her. It was an uncommon gesture, yet one that felt natural. The table was set simply, the meal unpretentious. They spoke easily, laughter touching their words for the first time. The conversation drifted from the fields to poetry, and when she quoted a line her husband had once favoured, Harland's eyes flickered with memory. "He used to read that to the men by the fire," he said softly. Said courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Margaret looked at him, startled. "You remember his voice?" Harland nodded. "I do." He spoke with conviction, but there was sadness too, as though he already knew the price. The remark struck her deeply. For years she had tried to preserve Henry's memory as flawless, unmarked by weakness. Hearing another speak of his doubt felt like seeing a portrait crack. Yet instead of anger, she felt a strange relief. The man she had loved had been human after all, not the untouchable figure she had built in her solitude. After supper, they lingered by the fire. The wind whispered against the windows, and the clock's steady rhythm filled the pauses between their words. Harland spoke of his plans to remain through the winter, if she would permit it, offering his service to oversee the estates during the colder months. She agreed without hesitation, though she disguised her pleasure beneath formality. "Your assistance would be of great value," she said. He inclined his head, gratitude and something warmer passing across his face. When he rose to take his leave, she accompanied him to the corridor. At the door of his chamber, he paused. "Good night, my lady," he said quietly. "Good night, Captain." Her voice was steady, yet inside her heart stirred with a mix of fear and anticipation she had not felt in years. She returned to her room unable to sleep, the memory of his gaze following her into the dark. A week later, an early frost silvered the fields. Margaret walked out at dawn to see it glittering across the grass. Harland was already there, inspecting the stables. When he saw her, he removed his hat and smiled, a small, genuine gesture that lit the cold morning. They spoke briefly, nothing remarkable. Yet when she returned indoors, warmth had settled where the chill had been. That night she wrote in her journal for the first time since her husband's death. The words came slowly, unevenly, but they were honest. "There is a gentleness in him that quiets the noise of my heart. I do not know whether it is friendship or something deeper, but I no longer fear its presence." She closed the book and sat for a long time in silence, listening to the wind in the chimneys. Outside, the leaves continued to fall, covering the paths with their slow surrender. Ashcombe Hall, once a house of mourning, now breathed again, alive with the subtle pulse of something like hope. The first snow of the season came earlier than anyone expected. It began with a single flake drifting past the window, and by evening the gardens were veiled in white. The hush it brought seemed to wrap the world in a soft stillness. Margaret stood at her window, watching the flakes gather upon the branches, the roses long since gone to seed beneath their blanket of frost. The sight filled her with a quiet melancholy and an odd sense of peace. It had been years since she had seen the first snow as something beautiful rather than mournful. Captain Harland had taken to spending his evenings in the library after his duties were finished, reading by the fire or writing in a small leather-bound notebook. The rhythm of their shared solitude had grown familiar. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they simply sat together in silence, the comfort of another presence easing the long hours. It had become a quiet companionship, shaped by unspoken respect. That night, as the snow fell steadily, Margaret brought a tray of tea to the library. The captain looked up from his book, surprised but pleased. "You should not brave the cold corridors for my sake, my lady," he said with a faint smile. "It is a small distance," she replied. "And besides, the snow deserves company." He laughed softly, a rare sound, low and warm. She poured the tea, their hands almost touching as she set his cup before him. For a moment, they sat without speaking, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint hiss of wind at the window panes. The glow of the flames lent a softness to his features she had not noticed before, and she thought that he looked younger in repose, as though time's weariness had loosened its hold. When he spoke again, his tone was quieter. "The snow always reminds me of the winter before Salamanca," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "We were stationed in the hills, waiting for orders that never came. The cold was merciless. Some men froze in their sleep." Margaret's hands stilled upon her teacup. She rarely heard him speak of the war. "It must have been dreadful," she murmured. He nodded. "Dreadful, yes, but also clarifying. A man learns then what truly matters: courage, loyalty, compassion, and what he can bear losing." There was a pause before she asked, "Did you serve long under my husband's command?" "From the beginning," he answered. "He was more than an officer to me. He was a friend." His voice faltered slightly on that last word, and she looked at him, waiting. The air between them seemed to shift, heavy with something unsaid. "He saved my life more than once," Harland continued. "The day he fell, it should have been me. He saw the cannon turn. He pushed me aside." He broke off, staring into the fire as though seeing it all again. "I have lived every day since with the weight of that moment." Margaret's breath caught. She had known her husband died bravely, but hearing it so plainly, from one who had stood beside him, pierced her heart in a new way. "You could not have changed it," she said gently. "Perhaps not," he admitted. "But I wonder, If he would have forgiven me had our positions been reversed. Some debts can never be repaid. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him her husband would have understood, yet the words felt too small. Instead, she reached across the table and laid her hand upon his. The gesture was instinctive, almost unconscious. His fingers tightened briefly around hers before he drew away, as though remembering himself. Silence followed, not awkward, but full of emotion too deep for speech. The fire burned low, its light flickering across their faces. When at last he rose to tend the logs, Margaret saw the tremor in his hands. It was not weakness, but grief made physical. Later that night, unable to sleep, she descended once more to the library. The fire had died down to embers, and the air held the faint trace of smoke. On the table lay the captain's notebook left behind. She hesitated, torn between respect for his privacy and a sudden irresistible curiosity. The cover bore the initials J.H. nothing more. She did not open it, though the temptation was strong. Instead, she carried it to the mantel and left it there, where he would see it in the morning. Standing in the quiet room, she thought again of his confession. For years she had believed her grief to be solitary, a private wound no one could share. Yet now she saw that the man who walked her gardens carried his own sorrow, intertwined with hers. Their lives had crossed through the same loss, two halves of a broken story seeking completion. The next day dawned bright and cold. Harland appeared at breakfast, composed as ever, though faint shadows lingered beneath his eyes. When she mentioned the notebook, he thanked her, his tone carefully neutral. They did not speak of the night before, yet something between them had altered. His reserve, once impenetrable, now seemed a fragile defense against emotions too deep to hide. In the afternoon, they walked together across the frozen lawns. The lake beyond the orchard lay glassy under its thin sheet of ice, reflecting a pale sky. "The world looks almost perfect in snow," Margaret said, "as if it forgives everything." "Perhaps it does," Harland replied. "Or perhaps it only hides what cannot be forgiven." She looked at him, startled by the quiet sorrow in his voice. "You speak as though forgiveness were beyond reach." "For some men it is," he said simply. Then after a moment, "For others, it might come from those they least deserve it from." Their eyes met, and for an instant, she felt the pull of understanding so complete it frightened her. She turned away, pretending to study the distant hills. "The snow will not last," she said. "It never does." "No," he agreed. "But while it falls, the world feels gentler." They walked on in silence. The wind stirred the branches overhead, scattering light flakes across the ground. Margaret thought of his words long after they returned to the house. That night, as she wrote again in her journal, she found herself tracing a single sentence. "He has given voice to my loneliness, and in doing so, eased it." What she did not yet know was that the truth he carried, the secret still sealed behind his calm composure, would soon come to light, and when it did, it would test the fragile trust between them as nothing else could. Winter lingered longer than anyone expected. The snow melted, returned, and melted again until the fields around Ashcombe Hall were veined with narrow streams that glimmered in the pale sunlight. Life within the estate moved at a slower rhythm, as if time itself were reluctant to step forward. Margaret found comfort in that stillness. It allowed her to pretend, if only for brief moments, that the outside world had forgotten her. But the world never truly forgot, especially when it scented something unusual enough to feed its endless appetite for gossip. The first whisper reached her through a letter from a distant cousin in Bath. Written with elaborate politeness, it spoke of concern over the frequency with which a certain retired officer was said to be seen at Ashcombe Hall. Margaret read the words twice, feeling the cold press of humiliation. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside, yet the message clung to her thoughts like smoke. Soon after, a neighbour called a baronet's wife known for her talent in conveying insults under the guise of sympathy. Over tea she mentioned, with a look of wide-eyed innocence, that people were beginning to speculate. "You have always been a paragon of discretion, my dear Lady Ashcombe," she said, "but tongues will wag, especially when a gentleman of such robust character is in close attendance." Margaret managed a faint smile. "I am sure the village will find a new topic soon. It always does." The woman sighed in exaggerated pity. "Perhaps, yet you must be careful. The world is unkind to widows who forget their place." When the visitor had gone, Margaret remained in her chair, staring at the dying fire. She was not a woman easily shaken, but shame and anger warred within her. The insinuation stung not only for its cruelty, but for its closeness to a truth she had not dared name. She did care for Captain Harland, though she had not confessed it even to herself. The realization, spoken only in the silence of her heart, frightened her more than gossip ever could. That evening she avoided the library. She took her supper alone and sent word that she was unwell. But as she sat in her chamber, the walls closing in with unaccustomed weight, she heard the faint sound of footsteps below the measured pace she now knew by heart. Her pulse quickened. A moment later came a soft knock at the door. "My lady," Harlan's voice said quietly, "forgive the intrusion. I wished only to ensure you are well." She hesitated before answering. "I am quite well, Captain. There is no cause for concern." He did not leave. "If I have done something to displease you," he said, "tell me. I will amend it." Something in his tone, the restrained urgency, loosened the knot within her. She opened the door. He stood there, hat in hand, his expression troubled. "It is not you," she said. "It is others. The world has decided to measure what it cannot understand." "Kamzak." His eyes darkened. "They speak against you?" "They whisper, yes. But I have lived long enough to survive whispers." He shook his head. "You should not have to." His voice hardened. "I will leave tomorrow. My presence has become a burden to your peace." She felt the blood drain from her face. "You would go because of idle words?" "I would go because I cannot bear that they stain your name." The simple conviction in his tone undid her composure. "And do you think my name so fragile?" she asked. "Do you believe I would let gossip rule my house?" "No," he said, "but I know what cruelty can do. I have seen honor destroyed by half a sentence. I will not be the cause of your suffering." The firelight flickered across his face, revealing the exhaustion behind his calm. For a moment she wanted to beg him to stay, but pride and fear held her still. "If that is your decision," she said quietly, "then I will not prevent it." "Gazgur." He bowed his head, the gesture full of sorrow. "It is not what I wish, but it may be what is right." When he was gone, she stood for a long time at the door, her hand resting against the wood as though she could still feel the echo of his presence. The silence that followed was unbearable. The next morning dawned grey, the sky heavy with low clouds. Margaret rose early, her heart weighted by a sense of impending loss. Downstairs, the servants moved quietly, aware of the tension that hung in the air. She found Harland in the stable yard, saddling his horse. The sight of his packed satchel on the ground beside him struck her like a physical blow. "You mean to keep your word, then?" she said. He turned, meeting her gaze. "It is better this way. Your life should not be shadowed by my mistakes." "What mistakes?" she asked sharply. "You have been nothing but honorable." He hesitated. "Honor can sometimes bring ruin when the world misreads its intent." She wanted to argue, but his expression silenced her. He mounted, reins in hand. For a moment he seemed about to speak, but instead he inclined his head. "Farewell, my lady." The title, formal and distant, cut deeper than any insult. "God keep you, Captain," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts. He rode away slowly, the sound of hooves fading down the frost-hardened lane. She stood there until the last echo vanished, her breath a mist in the cold air. When she turned back toward the house, it seemed larger and emptier than ever before. In the days that followed, gossip grew bolder. The same tongues that had once whispered now spoke more freely, convinced that the scandal of Ashcombe Hall had ended with the captain's departure. Margaret endured their false sympathy with quiet grace, but each polite inquiry was another reminder of what she had lost. Nights stretched long and silent. She returned to her garden, though winter had stripped it bare, walking the frozen paths where his footprints had once been. The roses, reduced to thorny stems, seemed to share her desolation. Yet beneath her grief stirred a strange pride. She had not begged him to stay. She had let him go with dignity. That knowledge, bitter though it was, steadied her. She told herself that if his feelings were as sincere as his words, he would return when the time was right. And if he did not, well, she had survived loneliness before. She could do so again. The world moved on, indifferent to her heart's turmoil. Letters arrived, were answered, and the routine of the estate resumed. But the quiet of Ashcombe Hall had changed. It no longer comforted, it accused. Every creak of the old timbers, every gust of wind through the chimneys, seemed to ask the same question: why had she let him go? The days after Captain Harland's departure stretched into weeks, measured only by the passing of clouds across a colourless sky. Margaret moved through her house as though performing an old ritual whose meaning she had forgotten. The rooms seemed to echo differently now, carrying not only silence but absence. At times she caught herself listening for a footstep that would never come. The loneliness she had once mastered now returned sharper than before, because it came laced with memory. The snow melted, giving way to a damp grey thaw. In the library, Fires burned constantly to chase the chill from the air. Margaret took refuge there, sorting through papers and correspondence in an attempt to occupy her mind. It was during one such afternoon, while rearranging her husband's old desk, that she found the letter. It was tucked beneath a loose drawer, folded neatly but yellowed with age. Her first thought was that it might be another from Henry's early campaigns. Yet when she opened it, she saw the handwriting was hers. No, not hers, but familiar. She realized with a jolt that it was her husband's hand, addressed not to her but to Captain James Harland. Her pulse quickened as she began to read. "My dear friend," it began, "I fear I have done a great disservice to the one person who has shown me unwavering faith. My wife deserves truth, yet I have withheld it. You know the reason: her health, her sorrow, but I can no longer justify the lie. Should anything befall me, I ask you to make right what I could not. Tell her the truth of my heart, that my coldness was never cruelty, only shame for what I could not give her." Margaret's vision blurred. The letter went on, speaking of regret, of affection never expressed, of a secret illness that had rendered Henry incapable of fathering a child. "Do not let her live, believing herself at fault," the letter ended. "She deserves peace, and you are the only man I trust to deliver it." Her hands trembled as she set the letter down. The room swayed. For years she had borne the silent conviction that she had failed as a wife, that her husband's distance had been disappointment cloaked in courtesy. To learn that the truth was otherwise, that the sorrow had not been hers alone, was both liberation and fresh agony. And to know that James Harland had known this truth, perhaps from the moment he first entered her house, filled her with something perilously close to betrayal. She sat motionless for a long time, staring at the flames. The letter felt heavy in her lap, a bridge between past and present she was not ready to cross. At last she rose and carried it to her chamber, placing it beside the small silver pendant she had locked away months earlier, two relics of a world built on secrets. That night sleep eluded her. Questions circled like restless birds. Had James meant to tell her? Had he withheld the truth out of pity, or fear, or perhaps to protect her husband's memory? The uncertainty gnawed at her until dawn. When morning came, her decision was made. She would find him and demand the truth. Fate, however, required no such effort. That same day, as she stood in the front hall giving instructions to her housekeeper, a rider approached through the mist. The figure dismounted stiffly, and even before the servant announced his name, Margaret knew. James Harland stood at her threshold once more, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He bowed deeply. "My lady, I did not expect—" "Nor I," she said, her tone controlled but cold. "What brings you back to Ashcombe Hall?" He hesitated. "I had business in the county. It seemed only right to pay my respects before returning north." "Business?" Her gaze held his. "Or conscience?" The faintest flicker of unease crossed his face. "If I have offended, tell me how. I will answer plainly." She turned and gestured toward the library. "Then you shall answer now." Inside, the fire burned low, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and dust. She handed him the letter. He took it, glanced once at the writing, and closed his eyes briefly. "So you have read it," he said. "Did you think I would not?" Her voice trembled. "You knew all this time that my husband's distance was not my fault, yet you let me live believing it was." "I swore to keep his confidence," he said quietly, "and in keeping it, you betrayed mine." He flinched. "I meant only to spare you further pain. The truth would have served no purpose then." "No purpose?" she repeated. "You call freedom from self, blame no purpose. You let me believe I was barren in every sense, that I had failed him, that I was unworthy of affection." "I thought he would tell you himself," James said, the words breaking from him. "He intended to, but death came too quickly. He stopped, his composure unraveling. "I could not bring myself to speak what was not mine to reveal." Margaret's anger faltered at the rawness in his voice, but hurt still burned beneath it. "So you pitied me instead," she said softly. "No," he said with sudden force. "Never pity, only respect, and—" He stopped again, the unspoken word heavy between them. She turned away, unable to bear the look in his eyes. The silence stretched, filled only by the low crackle of the fire. At last she said, "You should go. I cannot think clearly while you stand before me." He bowed his head. "As you wish." When he reached the door, she spoke again, not looking at him. "Was there ever truth between us, Captain? Or only kindness arranged to look like it?" He paused. "There was truth," he said quietly. "You are the proof of it." And then he was gone, leaving her alone once more, the letter still trembling in her hand. Outside, the mist thickened until the world beyond the windows disappeared. The snow began again, soft and relentless. Margaret watched it fall and thought of the first evening he had come to her door, bearing the box that had begun it all. She had believed then that grief was her only companion. Now she knew that love, too, could wound as deeply, not by cruelty but by silence. For several days after their confrontation, Margaret kept to her chamber, avoiding every room where memory might intrude. The letter from her husband lay folded on her desk, untouched, but never far from sight. She could not bring herself to destroy it, nor to read it again. It felt like a living thing, pulsing faintly with the echoes of all that had gone unsaid between three souls bound by love, duty, and guilt. James Harland had left Ashcombe Hall once more. His absence filled the corridors like cold air seeping through the walls. The servants, sensing the tension that had preceded his departure, moved about with subdued care, whispering when they thought she could not hear. Margaret wished they would speak openly, shout even, if only to break the suffocating quiet. Outside, the thaw returned, heavy rains washing away the last traces of snow. The garden paths dissolved into mud. Margaret rarely ventured out now. Her pride, once a shield, had become a prison. She told herself she was angry that he had deceived her, angry that he had presumed to decide what truths she could bear. Yet beneath the anger lived another feeling, one she dared not name, a hollow ache of longing. One evening, unable to sleep, she descended to the library. The fire had been laid but not lit, and the air smelled faintly of cold ash. She stood by the mantel, staring at the empty chair opposite hers. It was there they had spoken so many times, sometimes of trivial things, sometimes of matters too heavy for words. Now the silence mocked her. She pressed a hand to her eyes, furious at the tears that came unbidden. The next morning brought news from the village. A portion of the old bridge over the river had collapsed after the rains. 2 workers had been injured. 1 remained missing. The steward, pale and breathless, delivered the report. Captain Harland was among those who went to assist, he said. They say he went into the water after the man. Margaret felt the words strike her like a physical blow. Is he? They are searching, the steward answered. The current is strong. Without thought, she seized her cloak and hurried from the house. The air outside was thick with mist and the smell of wet earth. She reached the riverbank where a crowd had gathered, villagers, soldiers, farmers, all standing in anxious silence. The water churned violently below, brown with mud. Men shouted, ropes strained, and amid the confusion she caught sight of him. James was there, soaked to the bone, standing knee-deep in the torrent, holding fast to a makeshift line while 2 others dragged a half-conscious worker toward the shore. The current pulled hard, nearly toppling him, but he held his ground, muscles trembling with the effort. When the rescued man was safe, James waded to the bank, staggering as he climbed the slope. Margaret ran forward without thinking. "You fool," she cried, her voice breaking. "You could have been killed." Cool. He looked up, startled by the sight of her. Mud streaked his face, his hair plastered to his forehead. "It was necessary," he said simply. "The man would have drowned." Her anger melted into something else, terror, relief, love so tangled she could not tell them apart. "You should have let someone else go," she said. "There was no one else," he replied, and his voice, low and steady, carried a truth that silenced her. The villagers gathered around, offering blankets and praise. James brushed them off with quiet humility. When Margaret tried to guide him toward her carriage, he resisted. "I will not impose," he said. "You owe me nothing." "You are freezing," she insisted. "You will come to the house." This time he did not argue. The ride back to Ashcombe was silent except for the rattle of wheels and the faint hiss of rain against the windows. He sat opposite her, shivering but composed. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to thank him, but her throat refused to form the words. At the manor, she ordered the servants to prepare a fire in the drawing-room and bring hot wine. When they were alone, she turned to him. "You risked your life today," she said softly. He met her gaze. "Would it have mattered to you if I had not returned?" The question, quiet though it was, struck through her defenses. "Do not ask what you already know," she whispered. He took a step closer. "I know only that you do not trust me." "I trusted you with everything," she said, her voice trembling. "That is why the truth cut so deeply. You should have told me. I thought silence would spare you pain," he said. "I see now it only multiplied it." She turned away, her hand gripping the back of a chair. "Why did you come back?" He hesitated. "Because I could not stay away. Not while you still believed the worst of me." Quote, something inside her broke, then not anger, but the stubborn pride that had kept her heart sealed. She faced him again, tears standing in her eyes. "You have no right to care for me," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not," he answered, "but I do." For a long moment they stood in silence, the air between them trembling with all that had been denied. Then she said very quietly, "If you care for me, tell me the truth, not what you think will comfort me, but the whole of it." He drew a deep breath. "Very well. The day your husband died, he asked me to deliver a message, the letter you found. But he also made me swear another oath, that if ever I came to love you, I must tell you only when I could do so without shame. I broke that oath long ago." Her heart stilled. "You love me?" "Yes," he said simply. "From the moment I first saw you standing in your garden with those withered roses, mourning a man who had never understood your worth." The confession hung in the air, fragile and immense. She felt its truth as surely as she felt the beating of her own heart. Yet still she whispered, "And what am I to do with such love, when all it brings me is confusion?" He looked at her with infinite patience. "Do nothing. Let it be. Let it exist, even if the world refuses to understand it." Kai. Tears slipped down her cheeks unnoticed. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood before him. "You are impossible," she said softly. "So they tell me," he replied. She laughed through her tears, a sound half sorrow, half relief, and for the first time in months, the house felt alive again. The storm passed during the night, leaving the countryside washed clean beneath a fragile winter Sunday. When morning came, a quiet peace settled over Ashcombe Hall. The house, once so full of sorrow, seemed to breathe again. Fires glowed in every hearth. Light fell softly across the polished floors. Margaret stood at the window of the library, watching a thin mist rise from the meadows. Behind her, the faint sound of footsteps told her she was no longer alone. James entered, his shoulder bandaged from the strain of the rescue. The pallor had faded from his face, though exhaustion lingered in the lines around his eyes. "You should be resting," she said gently. "I have rested enough," he replied. "It is the silence that tires me now." She turned toward him, unsure how to answer. The night before had left her heart raw and uncertain. His confession had changed everything, yet nothing seemed settled between them. Love, spoken aloud, had not erased the past. It had only made its weight more visible. He crossed the room and stopped beside her. Together they looked out over the fields, where patches of frost still clung to the earth. "Do you regret what was said?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "No, but I do not yet know what to do with it." "You need do nothing," he said softly. "I asked for no promise." She met his gaze. "And yet you gave me one, whether you meant to or not." He smiled faintly. "Then let it be a promise kept in silence." And they stood there for a long moment, the quiet between them filled not with tension but with an odd serenity. Outside, a pair of birds darted across the pale sky, their flight sure and untroubled. Margaret watched them until they vanished beyond the trees. "Do you ever wish you could begin again?" she asked suddenly. James considered. "I used to, but I have learned that beginnings rarely come as we expect. Sometimes they appear disguised as endings." His words sank deep into her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by mourning or by duty, but by choice, her own choice. Yet, even as the thought took shape, reality intruded. She knew what the world would say if she chose him, a man of modest means and uncertain birth. Society would not forgive a widow of her standing for such defiance. Later that day, a carriage arrived from London bearing an unexpected visitor. Lady Pembroke, an old friend of her late husband and one of society's most attentive observers. She entered the drawing-room with a rustle of silk and the chill of judgment clinging to her like perfume. "My dear Lady Ashcombe," she began, "London is abuzz with talk of your recent heroics. They say Captain Harland risked his life to save a villager and that you nursed him back from death. How very dramatic. It seems the countryside has not dulled your gift for attracting attention." Margaret received her politely, offering tea and calm answers. But beneath the civility, she felt the edge of mockery in every word. Lady Pembroke's visit was not of concern but curiosity. When James entered briefly to deliver a report about the estate, the older woman's eyes gleamed with knowing amusement. "Ah, the gallant captain himself," she said. "How admirable, though one wonders if the gallantry ends at the riverbank." After he left, Lady Pembroke leaned forward. "My dear, forgive an old friend's candour. People will talk. You must think of your reputation." Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. "My reputation, madam, has endured greater storms than gossip." The woman smiled thinly. "Of course, but a widow must be cautious. Compassion is easily mistaken for affection, and affection for folly." Clang. When her guest departed, Margaret remained still for a long time, her face unreadable. That night, as she sat by the fire, she replayed the encounter in her mind. She knew that Lady Pembroke's words would echo through drawing rooms before the week was out. Society's judgment was swift and unforgiving, and yet, for the first time, she found she did not fear it. James came to her later, hesitating in the doorway. "You had a visitor," he said. "Yes, a friend from London, Crean, and she came to warn you against me," he said simply. Margaret did not deny it. "She came to remind me of what the world expects." He looked at her, his expression grave. "And what do you expect?" She hesitated. "I expect honesty. No more secrets, no more silence." He nodded slowly. "Then you shall have it, whatever may come." For several days afterward, life at Ashcombe resumed its gentle pattern. They walked together in the gardens, now stripped of colour but still beautiful in their bareness. Sometimes they spoke of the future, though neither dared to name it clearly. At other times they said nothing at all, content simply to share the same air. But peace never lasts unchallenged. One afternoon, a messenger arrived with a letter bearing the seal of the War Office. James took it to his room, and for hours there was no sound. When he finally emerged, his face was pale. He found Margaret in the hall and handed her the folded paper. "It concerns me," he said quietly. "A matter from the campaign, long unresolved." She read the brief notice, the words blurring. The letter summoned him to London to answer questions regarding a mismanaged supply convoy in which several men had died. An inquiry revived now that the army sought to tidy its history. "They mean to make you a scapegoat," she said. He smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they only wish for closure." Quote, "You cannot go," she said, her voice rising. "They will destroy you." "I must. Honor demands it." She stared at him, her composure cracking. "Honor has taken enough from you. Must it take you too?" He looked at her tenderly. "If I do not face it, I am not the man you believe me to be." The truth of that silenced her. She turned away, fighting tears. "Then go," she whispered. "But know that if you do, the house will feel emptier than it ever did before." Cried. He reached for her hand, lifted it to his lips, and kissed it gently. "Then I will return, if the world allows it," he said. The next morning, he rode away under a pale sky, leaving the gates of Ashcombe Hall swinging in the wind behind him. Margaret watched until he disappeared beyond the ridge. The quiet that followed was not the silence of grief, but of waiting. The days following James's departure unfolded with a quiet that felt heavier than grief. Ashcombe Hall returned to its old rhythm, the sound of servants' steps in distant corridors, the measured toll of the church bell, the sigh of wind through the chimney flues, but beneath the familiar calm, something essential was missing. Margaret moved through the rooms as though walking in a dream. Each object seemed charged with memory. The chair where he had sat to read, the cup he had once held, the path across the garden where their shadows had mingled in the afternoon Sunday. She tried to tell herself that she had done the right thing by letting him go. Honor, she reminded herself, was the foundation of his character. To deny him that would have been to deny the man she loved. Yet the thought brought her no comfort. Honor had claimed too much already. News from London was scarce. The roads were half impassable with early spring rains, and the postal routes were slow. Weeks passed before a letter came, written in James's careful hand. He spoke little of the inquiry itself, only that it was proceeding, and that he had been granted temporary lodging near the barracks. The tone was steady, but between the lines Margaret sensed weariness. He ended with a sentence that made her heart twist. "Do not trouble yourself for my sake. I have faced worse storms and survived them all, though never before with something left behind worth returning to." She read the letter many times, each reading deepening her ache. She wanted to write in reply, to tell him that Ashcombe no longer felt like home without him, but fear held her pen still. What if her words reached him only to wound further? What if he never came back to read them at all? It was early April when the rumours began. They came first as whispers from the servants, then as murmurs in the village, that Captain Harland's honour was not what it appeared. A London paper had printed a small notice claiming that he was under suspicion of mismanaging supplies, of causing unnecessary deaths through negligence. No official verdict had been reached, but the tone left little doubt about the intended judgment. Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her. She obtained the paper herself, reading the lines until they blurred. The article portrayed him not as a hero but as a man of ambition who had risen through cunning rather than merit, whose reputation for integrity was an illusion. Every word struck her as both false and cruel, yet she could not ignore the cold power of print. That evening, as she sat by the fire, Lady Pembroke's voice returned to her mind. Compassion is easily mistaken for folly. How eagerly society would seize this new tale, she thought, how quickly it would confirm its own prejudice. The next day, 2 acquaintances from the neighbouring estate called on her. Their conversation, though clothed in civility, was another kind of test. "You must be distraught, my dear," one of them said, eyes bright with curiosity. "To have placed your confidence in such a man, I cannot imagine the embarrassment." Margaret's answer was calm, almost serene. "I am not embarrassed. I am disappointed in those who judge before knowing." Calm. Her words silenced them, but she saw the exchange of glances as they took their leave. By nightfall, she knew the story would spread further. That night, unable to bear the confines of her room, she went down to the library. Rain beat softly against the windows. She lit a single candle and opened her journal, though her hand trembled too much to write. Instead, she whispered into the stillness, as if he might somehow hear. "I will not doubt you," she said aloud. "I will not let them make me doubt." The next morning she resolved to act. She would go to London herself. The decision startled even her. She had not left the county since her husband's funeral, but the thought of sitting idly while lies destroyed the man she loved was intolerable. Within 2 days her carriage was prepared. The journey was long and cold, the roads slick with mud, but determination carried her forward. By the time she reached London, her body ached with fatigue, yet her resolve remained unbroken. The city pressed around her like a living thing, noisy, grey, and full of rumours. At the inn where she stayed, she heard his name spoken more than once, often in tones of pity or disdain. Each repetition cut her afresh. She inquired at the barracks and learned that the inquiry had concluded that morning, but no verdict had been announced. The officer on duty hesitated before adding, "There are those who believe Captain Harland has taken the blame for another's failure." He refused to name names. Margaret felt pride and dread twist together in her chest. She thanked the man and asked where he might be found. "He left a short while ago," came the reply. "Said he was going to the river for air." She found him at dusk, standing near the embankment where the Thames moved darkly under the bridge. He turned at the sound of her voice, disbelief flashing across his features. "Margaret," he said, "you should not be here." "I had to come," she replied. "The things they are saying, none of it is true, is it?" He looked away toward the water. "Truth matters little once the world decides otherwise." "Then let me fight it with you," she said. "You should not face this alone." He shook his head. "If I let you share my disgrace, it becomes real. I cannot allow that." She stepped closer. "And if you push me away again, you destroy what remains of me. Is that what you want?" Her words struck him like a blow. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he took her hands in his. "They found me guilty of neglect," he said quietly. "I am dismissed from service. My name will carry a stain that cannot be removed." She felt the blood drain from her face. "Then let them stain it," she said fiercely. "A good name is nothing beside a good heart. You will come home with me." "Comes, home," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "Do you still call it that?" "I do, and so will you." The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain and river silt. Around them, the city noise blurred into a distant murmur. For the first time since their parting, he allowed himself to believe that redemption might be possible not through the judgment of men, but through the steadfastness of one woman's faith. They left London 2 days later, when the rain eased into a fine mist and the streets gleamed with reflected light. Margaret insisted that they travel by carriage rather than stagecoach. James, though reluctant to impose further, accepted her decision with quiet gratitude. Neither spoke much during the journey. The rhythm of the wheels over the uneven road filled the silence between them, steady and almost soothing. Every so often, Margaret would glance across the seat and find him gazing out the window, his face unreadable, the faintest trace of weariness around his eyes. He carried no bitterness, only a calm resignation that frightened her more than anger would have. The verdict had stripped him of title and career, but not of dignity. He sat as a man who had accepted loss and found peace within it. Yet Margaret saw what lay beneath that calm, the ache of a life's purpose taken away. On the third afternoon, as the countryside of Hampshire began to unfold around them in soft green and brown, she reached across and took his hand. "You are home now," she said simply. He turned to her, startled by the gentleness in her tone. "Home," he repeated. "I am not sure I know what that word means anymore." "It means a place that forgives," she answered. "And Ashcombe forgives us both." When they arrived, twilight lay across the fields. The manor stood silent as they approached, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. Margaret felt her throat tighten at the sight. It had been her prison once, then her refuge, and now it might yet become something else, something alive again. The servants greeted them with polite astonishment. No one had expected the captain's return. She gave quiet instructions that he was to be treated as an honored guest. That night, the two of them dined together in the small parlor rather than the grand dining room. A single fire burned in the hearth, the only light besides the candles on the table. For the first time in many months, Margaret felt no weight pressing on her chest. She listened as James spoke of the journey, of the people who had stood by him despite the disgrace, and of how the simplest acts of kindness had sustained him. When he paused, she said, "You once told me that beginnings hide within endings. Perhaps this is ours." He looked at her for a long moment, as if committing her face to memory. "If it is," he said, "then I will spend the rest of my life proving I deserve it." Spring came early that year. Within weeks, the garden stirred with new life. Buds swelled on the rose bushes, and the air carried the scent of earth renewed. Margaret returned to her morning walks, and often James joined her, his limp still faint but growing less pronounced with each passing day. They spoke little of the past. The inquiry, the letters, the shame, all of it seemed to dissolve in the presence of sunlight and birdsong. Yet healing, Margaret learned, was not a single moment but a slow unfurling. One morning, as she stood by the fountain, she said, "Do you ever think of what you lost?" He smiled faintly. "Every day, but I also think of what I found." "And what is that?" He took her hand, his touch steady. "A reason to begin again." The words were simple, yet they filled her with a warmth she had almost forgotten. In that instant, she realized that love was not always a blaze that consumed. Sometimes it was a quiet light that endured through every darkness. By midsummer, the villagers had ceased to whisper. Time, that patient silencer of scandal, had done its work. They saw only what was plain to see, that Lady Ashcombe had regained her spirit, and that the gentleman who walked beside her did so with respect and devotion. Invitations from London went unanswered. Margaret had no desire to return to a world that measured worth in titles and appearance. Her life was here now, among the hills and roses, where truth had once broken her and then set her free. One evening, as the sun dipped low, they stood together in the garden. The air shimmered with gold, and the roses were in full bloom. James bent to pick one of the blossoms, its color deep and rich, and placed it in her hand. "It was your husband who planted them," he said softly, "and you who kept them alive. But perhaps they were always waiting for this." "For what?" she asked. "For someone to see them as more than memorials." She smiled, touched by the simplicity of his words. "Then let them be our beginning." He nodded. "Our beginning, then, Crew." Later, as twilight deepened, they sat side by side on the stone bench beneath the yew tree. The scent of roses drifted around them, mingled with the faint hum of bees settling for the night. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath. "Do you ever think," she murmured, "that we were meant to find each other?" "I think," he said, "that we were meant to survive long enough to understand what love truly is." Quote. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet fill her. The years of loneliness, of guilt and misunderstanding seemed distant now, part of another life. The house behind them glowed softly through the windows, a beacon against the darkening sky. In that moment, Margaret understood that redemption did not erase pain. It transformed it, reshaping sorrow into strength. Her heart, once heavy with loss, now held something, gentler gratitude perhaps, or grace. When she opened her eyes again, the first stars had appeared above the garden. She looked at them and thought how strange it was that the same sky had watched her through every season of her life, through love and grief, and now, at last, through peace. James's voice broke the silence. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I never thanked you for saving me." She smiled. "You saved yourself. I only opened the door." Quote. He turned toward her, the fading light catching the lines of his face, and for the first time she saw not the soldier, nor the accused, nor even the man she had once pitied, but the companion of her days, the equal of her heart. They remained there until the last light slipped beyond the hills, the world wrapped in the tender hush of evening. And when they rose to go inside, The roses bowed in the breeze as though acknowledging what words could no longer express. That two hearts, tempered by loss and bound by quiet courage, had found their way home at last.